In a moment so fraught with images of racial injustice and social upheaval, it's easy to think that the scale of the protests, which are occurring both here in the US and abroad, indicates an inflection point, a sign that racial discontent has reached levels that signal substantive changes in the way that Black communities are perceived and policed. But such a conclusion diminishes the fact that African American history and literature is rife with examples of Black bodies being subjected to racist violence. What I would like to emphasize is not only the violence, but the ubiquity of white rage. We cannot talk about ending systemic racism without confronting the specter of white rage, a subject that seems never to be far from instances where racial animus turns violent. As a critic of African American literature, I suggest that the work of African American writers is replete with examples of the ubiquitous and seductive power of white rage. The first is the title story of James Baldwin's 1965 collection of stories, Going to Meet the Man, which features a flashback in which a character recalls being taken to see his first lynching by his parents as a small child. Caught up in the carnivalesque atmosphere of the lynching, the child experiences a host of emotions. Quote, he turned his head a little and saw the field of faces. He watched his mother's face. Her eyes were very bright. Her mouth was open. She was more beautiful than he had ever seen her, and more strange. He began to feel a joy he had never felt before. He watched the hanging, gleaming body, the most beautiful and terrible object he had ever seen till then. Well, I told you, said his father. You weren't never going to forget this picnic. His father's face was full of sweat. His eyes were very peaceful, end quote. Robert Hayden's poem, Night, Death, Mississippi, written in 1962, gives us three speakers, one an old man too old and infirm to accompany the mob. In part one, hearing the victim's cries in the distance, the old man goes out to stand on the porch and muses, quote, be there with boy and the rest if I was well again, end quote. Hearing the victim's cries once more, he thinks of his son's participation in the violence with pride and concludes, quote, have us a bottle, boy and me. He's earned him a bottle when he gets home, end quote. In part two of the poem, we hear the voice of the old man's son who declares, quote, Christ, it was better than hunting bear, which don't know why you want him dead. And as the poem comes to a close, we hear the voice of the younger man's wife in four compactly arranged lines as she states, you kids fetch Pa some water now so he can wash that blood off him, she said, end quote. What is striking in both examples is that the white rage that turns into murderous violence is rooted in quotidian behaviors, a lynching that is also a picnic, mob violence as a transgenerational practice, a reason for a father to be proud of a son, the handing down of white supremacist attitudes from one generation to the next. What comes through in these examples, and the countless other examples I could cite, is that white rage is both an affective circumstance, where the faces of snarling and screaming whites whose anger is focused on a black person who refuses to stay in her place, and an ideological one, where the mechanisms of the state are harnessed to prevent black progress. Whether it be violence aimed at individuals, Emmett Till, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, or George Floyd, or at communities like the Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Forsyth County, Georgia, whites who decide to inflict murderous violence on the bodies of black citizens do so because they believe that they have the moral authority to do so. In other words, white rage, be it from a mob or a police officer, its criminal behaviors notwithstanding, is perpetrated by people who see what they are doing as located outside the realm of criminality. For them, it might be a commitment to patriotism, loyalty, or order, but its aim is to confirm white supremacy as a form of common sense. If we are to engage the question of how to combat systemic racism, I submit that an awareness of the pervasiveness of white rage is essential.